She laughed, not a polite laugh, not the kind a person tries to suppress and fails. She laughed the way people laugh when they are absolutely certain no one in the room will correct them, open-mouthed, unhurried, the laugh of a woman who has never once had to question her own authority. Then she tore the check in half, then in quarters. Then she dropped the pieces on the counter between them, $3 million in certified funds falling like confetti, and she said, with the customer service smile already back in place, "Sir, I'm going to need you to leave before I call security." The man in the charcoal tweed blazer looked at the pieces. Then he looked at her. Then he said 2 words, "I'll wait." He turned, picked up his worn leather portfolio from the counter, the one she had glanced at and dismissed without a second thought, and he walked to the chair nearest the window, sat down, set the portfolio across his lap, and was still. His name was Aldous Pemberton. And he had been in rooms like this before. There is a particular kind of composure that only comes from one place, not from training, not from temperament, but from certainty. The certainty of a man who already knows how a story ends and has simply chosen to wait for everyone else to catch up. Aldous Pemberton was 54 years old. He had grown up in a 3-room house in Meridian County, 40 minutes from this exact branch, in a neighborhood the county planners had quietly declined to zone for commercial development for the better part of 3 decades. He had watched his father cash his paychecks at a check-cashing window because the nearest bank had found reasons, year after year, not to approve a basic savings account. He had not forgotten that. He had also not forgotten the morning, 22 years ago, when he had signed the paperwork on his first acquisition, a failing regional title company that everyone told him was worthless, and turned it quietly into the foundation of something that would take him the better part of 2 decades to build into what it was today. He did not talk about what it was today. That was not his way. The portfolio on his lap was worn the way things get worn when they have been used, not when they have been neglected. The leather at the corners had softened to a kind of dark silk. The brass clasp was dull with handling. There was nothing written on the outside, no monogram, no logo, no signal of any kind. Gayle Whitmore had looked at it for exactly 1 second when Aldous first set it on the counter. Then she had looked at his blazer, his scuffed Oxfords, and she had decided, in the way people sometimes decide things before they have thought them through, everything she needed to know. She had not asked what was inside. Behind the counter, at the second teller window, Precious Odum had watched all of it. She had watched Aldous approach, calm, unhurried, the portfolio under his arm. She had watched him present the check, slide it across the marble with 2 fingers, and state his request in the even, considered tone of someone who has done this kind of transaction before. She had watched the teller, young, uncertain, pick up the phone and call for the manager. She had watched Gayle Whitmore emerge from her office, take the check, hold it up to the light with the theatrical skepticism of someone performing for an audience, and then look at Aldous. Really look at him, at the blazer, the shoes, the portfolio, and make the decision that was already forming behind her eyes. And she had watched the check come apart. Precious did not move from her window. She did not say anything. What she did, in the 3 seconds while Gayle was still laughing and the torn pieces were still settling on the counter, was lower her right hand below the counter line, angle her phone, and take a photograph. The timestamp read 1:44 p.m. She slid the phone back into her pocket and returned her eyes to the lobby, expression unchanged. Gayle walked back to her office. She was still smiling. She had handled it. She was certain of that. She did not look back at the lobby. If she had, she would have seen him there, the man in the charcoal tweed blazer, sitting in the chair by the window, portfolio on his lap, not moving, not pacing, not watching the door, watching the clock. It read 1:47 p.m. Before we go further, if you've ever watched someone be written off in a room they quietly owned, you already know this feeling. Drop a comment below. Have you ever been in a room where someone underestimated you? Just say yes or no, because the people who find this channel tend to have a story. And if you believe the truth always surfaces, eventually this is the right place to be. Subscribe and stay close, because this story is only just beginning. 13 minutes passed. That was the first thing anyone who watched closely would have noticed. Not the torn check, not the scattered quarters of paper still lying on the counter where Gayle Whitmore had left them, but the fact that Aldous Pemberton had not moved a single inch. He sat the way a man sits when he is not afraid of time, portfolio on his lap, hands folded over the clasp, eyes moving occasionally to the clock above the teller windows. The lobby had the particular quiet of a room where something has just happened, and nobody is quite sure what to do with it yet. Gayle came out of her office at 2:01 on the clock she wasn't watching. She had expected the seat to be empty. She had expected the whole matter to have resolved itself the way she assumed these matters resolved themselves, quietly, with the person in question absorbing the message and removing themselves from the situation. Aldous had not received that message, or rather, he had received it and set it aside. She crossed the lobby with the energy of someone who had never once had to cross it twice for the same person. When she reached him, she did not lower her voice. "Sir." The word landed like a door closing. "I've asked you to leave." Aldous looked up at her. "You did," he said. "I'm still waiting." "There is nothing here for you to wait for." He did not argue that. He simply looked back at the clock. Gayle turned and summoned Terence from his post near the entrance doors with 2 fingers, the way you call a dog or flag a cab. Terence was a deliberate man. He moved carefully, read the room as he crossed it, arrived at the bench with his hands loose at his sides and nothing decided on his face. "Terence," Gayle said, her voice carrying easily to the teller windows, to the 2 customers near the ATM, to the young woman behind the second window who was not looking at her screen. "Would you please escort this gentleman out?" Terence turned to Aldous. Aldous met his eyes and said quietly enough that only Terence could fully hear it, "I have a 2 o'clock meeting with the regional team." Terence paused. It was a small pause, half a second, maybe less, but it was the pause of a man whose instincts were telling him something his instructions weren't accounting for. He looked at Aldous. He looked at the portfolio. He looked at the clock, which now read 1:53. He did not move. Gayle saw the hesitation and laughed, not a polite laugh, not an uncomfortable one, a laugh that was meant to be heard. "These people," she said to Terence, and the words were easy in her mouth, practiced almost always, "have a meeting." The lobby went cold, not loud, not dramatic, just cold. The way a room goes when something has been said that cannot be unsaid, and everyone in it knows it, and nobody is quite sure yet what it means for them that they were present. Precious Odum behind the second window had stopped typing. She had already taken the photograph of the torn check pieces. That was done. That was safe in her phone, time-stamped. Now she was watching Gayle's face, watching the way certainty can look exactly like authority until the moment it doesn't. She said nothing. She forgot nothing. Aldous stood, not to leave, but to straighten. He adjusted the lapel of his blazer, the way a man does when he is entirely comfortable and simply maintaining his own standard. He gave Terence a small, even nod, the kind that says no harm. None of this is yours. And then he sat back down. Terence returned to his post near the door. Gayle watched this happen and decided it confirmed everything she already believed. Back in her office, she leaned over Hal's desk and told him to pull the contact information for Hargrove and Sons Private Bank. She said the name with a slight emphasis on the word Sons, as if the name itself were evidence. "I want to expose this," she said. "Call them. Find out what this institution actually is." Hal nodded and began his search. What Hal found, or rather what he didn't find, was this. Hargrove and Sons Private Bank had no public-facing retail presence, no branch locator, no general customer service line, no social media. The website was a single page, a crest, an address in a city that was not this one, and a phone number with no extension listed. He called the number. It rang 4 times. A human voice answered, not a menu, a human, said the name of the institution. And when Hal explained he was calling from a retail branch to verify a deposited instrument, the voice said, with perfect courtesy, that Hargrove and Sons did not process routine branch inquiries, and that any verification requests should be submitted through the appropriate correspondent banking channels. Then the line went quiet, waiting. Hal said he would follow up and thanked them and hung up. He reported back to Gayle, and Gayle heard exactly what she had expected to hear. She walked to the back office doorway and addressed the 3 people at their desks as if she were closing a case. "The institution cannot be verified through standard channels," she said, "which is exactly what you'd expect from a fraudulent issuer. I made the right call. I handled it perfectly." Nobody in the back office said anything. One of them nodded. One looked at her screen. One looked at his hands. Near the far wall of the lobby, the local news camera had been pointed at the branch's new digital teller signage when the morning began. It was not pointed there anymore. The producer had made the call quietly, a small circular gesture to the cameraman, index finger rotating once. Keep rolling. The prearranged community banking feature could wait. What was happening in this lobby? The man in the tweed blazer, the torn pieces of paper on the counter, the security guard who had paused, that was something else. She didn't know what yet, but she knew what it looked like when a story was already happening and hadn't finished. Aldous sat with his hands on the portfolio clasp and watched the clock move to 1:57. He had not made a single phone call. He had not raised his voice. He had not explained himself to anyone who had not earned the explanation. 3 minutes. In the back office, Hal opened the branch's corporate ownership directory to file his incident report. Standard procedure after any flagged transaction. He needed the parent company name for the record. He typed in the branch identifier. The directory populated. He read the name of the holding company that owned this bank, this branch, this building, and the desk he was sitting at. His finger stopped above the keyboard. He had seen that name before, somewhere, today. He looked at the incident report on his left screen. He looked at the directory on his right. He looked at the account application Gayle had thrown in the counter trash, the one he had quietly retrieved and set on the corner of his desk, face down because something in him had not been ready to throw it away. He turned it over. He read the business name printed in Aldous Pemberton's careful, unhurried hand, and Hal sat very still. The name sat on the screen like something that shouldn't be there. Hal had retrieved the application from the trash behind the counter. Gayle had swept it off without reading it, the way you sweep a receipt you don't need. But Hal was the kind of person who filed things, who cross-referenced, who had, in 3 years at this branch, never once submitted an incident report with a blank field. He'd smoothed the paper against his desk and read the business name Aldous Pemberton had printed in the applicant line, neat and unhurried, the way the man himself moved. First Meridian Capital Group, LLC. He'd typed it into the branch's internal corporate directory, not because he suspected anything, but because that was the field that needed filling. The directory returned one result. First, Meridian Capital Group, parent holding company, Meridian Savings Network, all branches. Hal read it twice. Then he sat back in his chair and did not move and did not say anything and looked at the clock on his screen, which read 1:49 p.m. Out in the lobby, Gayle had no idea any of this was happening. She had, in fact, grown more certain with every passing minute. Her assistant had called the number on file for Hargrove & Sons Private Bank, the institution printed on the cashier's check, and been met with a brief recorded message directing all inquiries to a written request process, followed by silence. No customer service line, no branch directory, no press 1 for this, press 2 for that. Just a name, a number, and a door that didn't open. Gayle had received this report at her desk and felt the satisfaction of a woman whose instincts had been proven correct. "They don't pick up," she'd told her back office staff, "because there's nothing to pick up for." What Gayle did not know, what she had no reason to know and no curiosity to discover, was that Hargrove & Sons Private Bank had operated since 1987 by a single governing principle. They did not accept unsolicited inquiries from institutions with which they had no existing relationship. Not because they were difficult, because their clients, none of whom maintained a relationship balance below $50 million, expected discretion as a baseline condition of doing business. The unverifiability wasn't a red flag. It was the credential, a check drawn on Hargrove & Sons and presenting as unverifiable through standard channels meant exactly one thing to anyone who knew what that institution was. The account holder was precisely who they said they were, and then some. Gayle knew none of this. She walked back into the lobby with the confidence of someone who had just solved a problem. She stood in front of Aldous Pemberton, and she spoke clearly and at a volume that carried. She told him about the seriousness of presenting fraudulent instruments to a federally regulated institution. She told him about the provisions under the relevant statutes. She used the phrase consequences under federal law twice, and she gestured once toward the door and once toward the counter where the torn pieces of the cashier's check still lay. Aldous listened. He did not shift in his seat. He did not look at the torn pieces. He did not look at the camera that had, by this point, quietly repositioned itself 15 feet to Gayle's left, its lens finding the angle that caught both her face and the counter behind her in the same frame. He looked at Gayle. When she finished, he said, "I understand. You believe that." 5 words, delivered without heat, without irony, without anything that could be called a challenge. Just 5 words that sat in the air of the lobby the way a full stop sits at the end of a sentence that doesn't need explaining. Gayle blinked. Then she straightened her blazer and walked back toward her office, and the lobby returned to its ambient hum, and the television producer behind the camera said nothing to her crew, just made a small motion with 2 fingers that meant, "Keep rolling." At 2:01 p.m., a private banker at Hargrove & Son, having received an automated compliance alert that a check drawn on their institution had been flagged as potentially fraudulent at a retail branch, called the bank's corporate compliance line directly, not the branch, not Gayle's desk, the corporate line. He left a message in a measured, unhurried voice. The check was valid, the account was in good standing, and the account holder's identity had been confirmed against the institution's records. He left a callback number and ended the call. The message routed to the regional office voicemail. The regional office was, at that moment, empty. The message sat there, time-stamped and unheard while 37 minutes passed, and in those 37 minutes, Gayle remained at her desk, satisfied. Hal remained at his, pale and motionless, and Aldous Pemberton remained in his chair near the window, portfolio on his lap, watching the clock with the patience of a man who understood, in a way Gayle never had, that the truth does not move faster because you need it to. It arrives exactly when it arrives. At 1:58 p.m., Hal had stood up from his desk. He wasn't sure why, exactly. He'd needed air, or distance, or just something to look at that wasn't the screen. He'd walked to the back office window that overlooked the parking lot and stood there with one hand on the frame. A black town car turned in off the main road and pulled into the lot slowly, the way cars move when the person inside already knows where they're going. The door opened. A silver-haired man stepped out, barrel-chested, unhurried, dressed in a charcoal pinstripe suit with a pocket square folded precisely at the breast. He reached back into the car and retrieved a leather portfolio. Hal could read the embossing from the window. 3 words. First Meridian Capital Group. Gayle had been watching the parking lot for the last 4 minutes. She had seen the town car ease into the space reserved for corporate visitors. The space, she had always assumed, was a formality, a courtesy painted on asphalt for visits that never quite materialized. She had straightened her name badge, smoothed the front of her blazer. She did not know exactly who was coming, but she knew the embossed leather portfolio, and she knew that a man who carried one of those deserved to be met at the door. She was ready. Noel Satterfield did not slow down. His eyes moved across the lobby the way a man's eyes move when he already knows the floor plan, not curious, just confirming. He registered Gayle's extended hand the way you register a door you've already decided not to open. And he kept walking, past the counter, past Hal, who had gone very still at his desk, past the torn check pieces that someone had swept to the edge of the counter but not yet discarded. Aldous Pemberton had not moved from that chair in 2 hours and 13 minutes. He rose as Noel reached him, unhurried the way he did everything, and the 2 men shook hands with the ease of people who have met before, who have spoken on the phone, who have exchanged documents with signatures at the bottom. "Mr. Pemberton," Noel's voice carried in the lobby without effort, "I am so sorry. I'm 2 minutes late, sir. Should we use the conference room?" The word "sir" landed in the room like something physical. Gayle's hand came down, slowly. The smile did not disappear so much as it lost its architecture, the muscles still holding the shape, but the intention behind it gone entirely. Hal, at his desk, looked at his screen. Precious, at her teller window, looked at nothing in particular. The television camera, which had been drifting toward the parking lot, swung quietly back toward the lobby. Aldous said, "The conference room is fine," and the two men turned toward the back of the branch. It was then that Noel turned. He looked at Gayle the way you look at something you need to address before you can move on. He read her name badge, just the name. Then he said, with a quiet that had no heat in it at all, "Ms. Whitmore, I'm going to need you to remain available. We have some things to discuss after Mr. Pemberton and I conclude." He did not wait for her response. The conference room door closed. Aldous set his portfolio on the table and opened it for the first time since he had placed it on the teller counter 2 hours ago. The same portfolio Gayle had glanced at and dismissed, the one she had never once thought to ask about. Inside, the executed acquisition agreement, 41 pages, signed and countersigned, the board resolution authorizing majority ownership transfer, the letter of authorization identifying this branch visit as the first official act of his new controlling interest in First Meridian Capital Group. The worn leather had been carrying all of it the entire morning on his lap, 3 feet from where Gayle Whitmore had torn his check into quarters. 3 minutes later, there was a knock at the conference room door. Noel opened it. Precious Odum stood in the doorway. She was not nervous. She had been waiting for the right moment with the same patience she had been practicing since 1:47 p.m., when she had photographed the torn check pieces before anyone thought to clear them away. She held out her phone. "I thought you should have this, Mr. Satterfield." The screen showed the time-stamped image, the counter, the 4 torn quarters of a $3 million cashier's check, the marble surface, the time-stamp reading 1:49 p.m. She returned to her window without waiting for a reply. That was all she needed to say. She had known from the moment she took the photograph that the image would find its way to the right hands. She had simply made sure of it. Out in the lobby, Gayle Whitmore stood where Noel had left her. She was still available as instructed. She had not moved toward her office. She had not called anyone. Whatever certainty had carried her through the morning, the laugh at the counter, the speech about federal consequences, the performance she had delivered to a room she believed was watching her handle a problem, that certainty had no floor under it anymore. The television news producer, who had been quietly watching the conference room door, picked up her phone and called her editor because the community banking feature she came to film had just become something else entirely. The editor watched the footage twice before she said a word. The first time, she was looking for the news story. The second time, she understood she already had it. What the crew had captured was not filler. It was not background texture for a community banking segment. It was Gayle Whitmore, branch manager of Meridian Savings, standing in her own lobby, delivering a measured speech about federal fraud statutes to the man whose name was on the ownership documents of the building she was standing in. The camera had caught all of it, the torn check pieces on the counter, the practiced smile, the lobby going cold, and Aldous Pemberton in his charcoal tweed blazer, watching without expression, saying 4 words, "I understand you believe that." The editor called her producer back and said, "Pull the banking feature. We have something else." That evening, Aldous sat in his hotel room while the city moved outside the window. He had ordered nothing. He had called no one. There was nothing left to arrange. The documents were signed, the accounts would open in the morning, and everything that needed to happen had been set in motion long before he walked through those doors. He had known that when he sat down by the window. He had known it when he looked at the clock. At 6:47 p.m., the segment aired. The chyron ran beneath Gayle's own face, beneath her own words, beneath the moment she had been most certain of herself. Branch manager destroys check belonging to bank's parent company owner. The station had sourced the footage from their own camera. They needed nothing else. By midnight, the clip had been shared 40,000 times. By morning, it had been viewed 1.4 million. Gayle did not see the segment when it aired. She saw it the way most people in her position eventually see the thing that ends them, on someone else's phone the next morning, forwarded without comment by a colleague who had always smiled at her in the hallway and would not be smiling again. She called the branch. No one answered her extension. She called the regional office. She was transferred without explanation to corporate communications. The statement from First Meridian Capital Group's communications office was released at 9 a.m. It was 4 sentences. Gayle Whitmore had been placed on immediate administrative leave pending a full ethics review. The incident was under investigation. The company did not comment on personnel matters. Further inquiries should be directed to legal. What Gayle had not accounted for, what she could not have, because she had never imagined needing to, was Hal. Hal had filed his incident report the same afternoon. He had written it accurately and completely, the way a man writes something he suspects will be read by people far above his pay grade. He had included her exact words. He had included the timestamps. He had noted the torn check, the lobby speech, the instruction to security, and the phrase, "These people always have a meeting," in its own line, unembellished, attributed correctly. Hal was not brave. He was simply precise. And precision, in the end, is its own kind of courage. The Hargrove & Sons compliance message, time-stamped 2:01 p.m., 14 minutes after Gayle tore the check, was recovered from the regional office voicemail and entered into the record. It confirmed the check's full validity. It confirmed the account holder's identity. It had been sitting there, unheard, while Gayle gave her lobby speech about federal fraud statutes. Precious Odum's photograph, the one she had taken under the counter, quiet and unhurried while Gayle was still performing, was submitted as primary documentation. Time-stamped 1:49 p.m. The torn pieces arranged on the counter exactly as they had fallen. The check number visible, the amount visible, the signature line visible. Precious had said almost nothing all morning. She had simply watched and remembered and done one small thing at the right moment. Sometimes that is the whole of it. Drop a comment if you've ever watched someone like Precious in your own life. The quiet one in the room who sees everything. Those people matter more than we say. The next morning, Aldous returned. He was greeted at the door. The interim manager shook his hand and said his name correctly and asked if he would prefer the conference room or the counter. Aldous said the counter was fine. He deposited the replacement cashier's check, issued same day by Hargrove & Sons, the figures identical to the one that had been torn into quarters and dropped on the marble. Without incident, without theater, without anyone holding it up to the light. The transaction took 4 minutes. Before he left, he walked to Precious's window. He did not say much. He extended his hand across the counter, and she took it, and he held it for a moment the way you hold the hand of someone who understood without being asked. She nodded once. He nodded back. Then he turned and walked out the way he had always moved, unhurried, quiet, the leather portfolio under his arm, the scuffed Oxford steady on the marble floor, the charcoal tweed blazer a little more worn in the morning light, and worth every dollar of it. The story did not end with a confrontation. There was no scene where Aldous stood over anyone, no moment where he raised his voice or made a speech. That is not how these things end when they end correctly. They end with paperwork filed, with voicemails recovered, with a photograph taken quietly under a counter by a woman in wire-rimmed glasses who trusted that the truth would eventually need a record. They end with a man walking out of a building exactly the way he walked in. If you believe the truth has a way of surfacing, that quiet people with steady hands tend to outlast loud ones with borrowed authority, leave a like on this video. And if someone in your life needs to see a story like this one, send it to them. Not for the drama, for the reminder. Weeks later, when reporters asked Aldous what he was thinking in those minutes after Gayle tore the check, those quiet minutes by the window, portfolio in his lap, watching the lobby, he paused for a long moment before he answered. Then he said, "I was thinking about the clock. I knew what time it was. Some people walk into a room knowing exactly what they carry. They don't need to announce it. They don't need to prove it. They just need to wait, because time has a way of doing the announcing for them. If this story stayed with you, subscribe." This is the kind of story we tell here, quietly, carefully, and for the people who believe that dignity always has the last word. Thanks for watching. The end screen has more.